In this video, I'm gonna show you how to make a true 3D button inside of After Effects using the new Advanced 3D Render engine. This is the same 3D engine that I covered in a previous video when it was just a beta feature, and a lot of people had opinions. Plus, I made a button rig for you to download so you don't even have to create your own buttons if you don't want to. If you didn't know, there's a Jake in Motion Discord server and it is full of amazing people. You should come join us. There's an invite link down in the description. One of the members of my server asked if it was possible to extrude a 3D layer forwards in Z space instead of backwards like it does by default so that they could easily animate something like a button being pushed. It's really not that difficult to set up if you're comfortable using expressions, but I happen to know that this particular user is also a student of my brand new course, Launch into After Effects, which is the most comprehensive intro to After Effects ever, where you get to create 10 really fun motion design projects, each teaching you a different part of the program. There are over 100 video lessons, more than 20 hours of content, and it's all structured in an easy to follow format for beginners all the way through advanced users. Head over to jakeinmotion.com or click the card above to join and launch your motion design career. Now, I knew that Kevin was a beginner in After Effects, so I thought this was a perfect opportunity to teach my process for creating a 3D button in After Effects. So let's jump right in and start building that button. I need to first just make a shape layer the size of the button that I want it to be. I've set up a basic comp, but there's nothing special about it. I just created this background for it. Let's make a new rectangle. I'll go up to my rectangle tool and double click on it to make a rectangle the size of my comp. And then I'll come over to my properties panel, which I love, by the way. This is a new recent addition to After Effects. You should definitely start using it. It's under the window menu and down here, properties. And what it's going to do is update based on what you have selected and even the tools that you have active. It's really, really useful. I'm gonna go into here and just change the size of this rectangle down so I don't have to dive into the contents here. I'll unlink the width and the height and I'll just make it, let's say 500 by 200. So there's a rough button shape. But I want it to be 3D, so I need to enable the 3D layer switch. And if you don't see that switch, come to the very bottom left corner of After Effects and just make sure this button right here is highlighted. That should show you the 3D layer switch. Now I know that's active because I've got the cube right there inside of that. And I have the 3D gizmos up here letting me know this is now working in 3D space. So I can switch to my rotation tool, rotate this around. We now have a 2D layer inside of 3D space. Great, but I want a 3D layer with actual geometry. So how can I do that? Well, currently I can't because I'm using the classic 3D render engine. That's right here. If you click on this menu right here though, you can switch it to Advanced 3D or Cinema 4D. But Advanced 3D is only available on After Effects versions 2024 or higher. So if you're using an older version, this technique's not gonna work for you and you're not gonna be able to use my button rig. Cinema 4D also supports extrusions, but it is slower. So we're going to go with the new Advanced 3D render engine, which is actively being worked on, so there may be changes to this in the future. If you're watching this further in time than when I posted it, things may have changed, but currently this is the best way I know to natively create 3D extrusions in After Effects. So what I wanna do is just rotate this layer to the side a little bit so we can see some depth when we go to extrude it, but also I wanna point out that it got darker when I rotated it. Now, when you create a 3D scene in After Effects, there is a default camera and there is default lighting. So even though I haven't placed any lights or cameras in this comp, it's using the After Effects default camera, you can see it right here, and default lighting. We're gonna come back to that in just a minute, but for now, let's just extrude the layer. It's really easy to do. I'll go into the contents, down into geometry options. This is available for shape or text layers, vector layers basically. And I wanna come down to extrusion depth. It's set to 0, but if I increase it, it's going to immediately extrude out the back of my layer. That's exactly what we wanted. Now we have a true 3D rectangle box inside of After Effects, and it renders really quickly. You see how I'm rotating this around? It's really not lagging at all. And that's what I like about the Advanced 3D engine. If I switch this back over to Cinema 4D, it takes a little bit of time to refresh and get the Cinema 4D renderer loaded, but now that it's there, not only does it look different, but rotating this, look at how much more lag there is in this render engine. There are pros and cons to everything, but in my opinion, render time almost always trumps everything else. So that's why I'm doing this using Advanced 3D. So I'm gonna switch back to that. We're back to our zippy, snappy render times. That's great. But what about the lighting? That default lighting set that we were talking about that's changing up the shading. I want this to basically appear as if it's a shape layer with flat colors. Well, to do that, I'm first gonna go into my material options and basically turn off everything that's affected by light. So I'm gonna take my accept shadows and I'm gonna click on it twice so that it's off. I'm going to leave my ambient at 100%, turn my diffuse all the way down to 0, turn the specular intensity all the way down to 0, my specular shininess all the way down to 0, and my metal all the way down to 0. And my layer is now black, and that's just because there's basically nothing that's catching the default lighting to light up this shape anymore. So that's why I need to add my own light. I'm gonna come up to the layer menu, new, light, and I'm gonna change this from the light type of point to ambient. If you're not familiar with 3D lights and cameras in After Effects, that's okay. Just follow along with what I'm doing and you're gonna get the same result. But we want an ambient light set to white at an 100% intensity. I'll click OK, and now we have this flat shaded box. There is no more depth information from the different shading values of the different sides. It looks like this flat box that's just being rendered as one color. That's exactly what we want, because now I can go into this layer, let's call this box, and I'll go into the shape group and come over to the add menu. Now, if I move this up a little bit, we should be able to see all the options. This section right here is the styling for the geometry. So we have front, bevel, side, and back controls. I don't have a bevel on my geometry, so I'm not gonna worry about that, but I do want a color control for the side that's independent from the shape layer's color itself. I could put one for the front, but it's the same as the actual fill color for this shape, so I don't need to. Instead, we'll go to side and I'll choose color. And now I have a second color control just for the extrusion. So I could make this a different color. Let's say a dark gray color. Click OK, and now I have two different colors for my box. Shaded flat, it still looks like shape layers, and that's the look I'm going for. But now that I have those two colors set up, I can use my extrusion depth property inside of the geometry options to control how deep that button is. But that brings up the next problem, which is this extrusion is only moving backwards. I can't go at a negative direction so that the face of the button is coming out and the back of the button is basically staying in place. Honestly, the simplest fix for this would probably just be rotate the layer around, and now the extrusion is going to go from that side, but you can't really parent anything easily to that back face so that it moves with the extrusion. So I'm gonna undo that until we're back to where we were, and this is where some expressions are going to come into play. Now, it's not that complicated, don't be scared, but what I wanna do is basically solo this property, and to do that, just double tap the S key on the keyboard, and I also wanna bring up the position property for this layer, so I'm gonna hold Shift and press P, which will also add the position property. Now I'm just looking at the properties I'm concerned with, and basically what I'd like to do is link the Z position of this layer to the extrusion depth. So actually, let me press Shift plus R to bring up the rotation, and I'm just gonna zero out the orientation here so we're looking at it straight on, and I'll switch to my camera tool and rotate to the side instead of rotating the layer, and I'll tell you why in just a little bit. Again, I don't have a camera in my scene, but there is a default camera that I can reposition. So now that I've got this angled to the side, but it's all aligned with no rotation, I want this Z position value to be affected by the extrusion depth. Fortunately, this is measured in pixel values, so there's a 1-to-1 relationship between these two. So what I need to do is add an expression on the position property, and basically I wanna just leave the X and Y position values freely adjustable by me, so that even with this expression applied, I can still affect those values. To do that, I'm going to just quickly make some variables. So VAR for variable, or if you want to be super fancy, we can use constants. So I'll just say CONST, and then I need to give it a name. So I'm going to say X position equals, and then I'm going to grab my expression pick whip and select this first property, the X position. That'll fill that in. I'll finish that with a semicolon, and then to save myself some clicking, I'm just going to copy and paste that 2 more times for Y position, and I'll change this value to a 1. These are array values from this array of property values here, 0, 1, and 2. And so the last one would be 2, that would be my Z position. So now I have variables I can use to target each one of those numbers, and I can write my new array, which needs opening and closing square brackets. After Effects automatically fills that in for me after I do the first one. And inside of this, I'm just going to type X position, comma, Y position, comma, Z position, and then I'll finish that off with a semicolon. What I've effectively done is absolutely nothing, because all of these variables are referencing these values right here, so I can still freely adjust the position of all of these values. It's just set up in a way that now I can go in here into my expression array and change the Z position to be influenced by the extrusion depth. But first I'm going to make a variable for that extrusion depth. So I'm gonna say CONST equals extrusion depth, and we'll say equals, and I'll grab my expression pick whip, grab the extrusion depth property, finish that with a semicolon, and now I can reference that just by using my variable. So I'm gonna come down to my Z position, and instead of that value, I want it to be this extrusion depth. So I'll click off, and I get an error. Surprise, I accidentally used 2 equals. I don't need one right here, so I'm going to get rid of that. But now we've got the extrusion depth value plugged into our Z position, while still maintaining the adjustability of the X and Y position values. That's cool, but it's not exactly what I want, because if I increase and decrease this extrusion, you see that it's shifting the Z position around, not in the way that I want it to. Instead, what I need to do is just invert this value by putting a minus on the extrusion depth. And now if I click off, it's going to behave exactly the way that I want it to. That extrusion is going to come forward, leaving that back locked into place, just like we were hoping. So now I have that 3D button, and I could say, type out some text. I'll just say button, and I'll make that 3D. I'll click and drag the parent pick whip, hold shift and select the box layer so that it moves the transformations to match that box layer. And then I can just shift this down a little bit. I'm getting a little bit of weirdness on certain areas. This is just because the text layer is on the exact same place as the face of this box. To fix that, I'll just bring up the position in my properties panel. Let's find it right here, layer transform. I'm gonna take the Z position and just subtract 1 from it. So it's 1 pixel forward in front of that box, and maybe I'll just make it a little bit smaller. But now that text is locked in place to this layer, and because that Z position is linked to the extrusion depth, it's going to move when I animate the extrusion. So there we have it, a working 3D button in After Effects with true 3D geometry. If you wanted it to extrude in the opposite direction, you wouldn't need this expression at all. Then it would just be like this, and you could have a long shadow effect almost. Or if you wanted to extrude from the middle, we could say minus extrusion depth times 0.5, so having that value basically, and now it's going to move in both directions from the center of the box. So lots of options there, but there's still some issues with this expression setup that I want to walk you through. First of all, let's make a new camera for this scene. Since we're just using the default so far, I'll come up to Layer, New, Camera, and I want to make this, we'll just say 35 millimeters, click OK. And remember, this box is not rotated, the scene camera was, so that's why we were seeing the side. And now that we've created a camera, it's going to be defaulted to looking directly at the box. But if I rotate this camera to the side, we're gonna be able to see some perspective shift because of the focal length of the lens that I chose. If I go into this layer, into the camera options, I have this zoom value. As I zoom in further, we're essentially extending the focal length of the lens. This behaves the same way that it does in the real world with physical lenses. The longer your lens, the more zoomed it is, the more compressed your image is going to get in terms of the perspective that it shows. And the wider angle your lens is, the more distortion you're going to see. Because I had to zoom this far out, I would need to dolly my camera in a lot closer, and now I have all kinds of lens distortion because of the focal length that I have my lens set to. This is the same reason why I look pretty normal on my phone's default camera, completely distorted on the wide angle lens, and completely different on my telephoto lens. So what we need to do in After Effects is just increase this value to an insanely high number and then zoom out so that we still see our button. The more we zoom in, the more we're basically flattening that perspective. This is something that in 3D software is called isometric views, and it's really easy to do in Cinema 4D or Blender. It's totally unrealistic, but it's a stylized look that a lot of people like. In After Effects, the best we can do is zoom in really far and back our camera up really far. But I don't want this back and forth process. I want something that's easy to control. So I'm gonna go into the zoom property and add an expression, and I just want this to be the negative value of the Z position. So whatever that value is, invert it, and because there is a 1-to-1 relationship between the zoom and the position of the camera, I can now just change the position and the zoom will match it. Now the camera is rotating around because this is a 2-node camera, but if I change my point of interest to 960 by 540 and 0, and then change the position to 960 by 540. Now I can back this up to a really high number and we're going to eliminate that perspective, or I could zoom in really far if we like that distorted look, and however I rotate this, it's now going to be affected by that focal length. So I want to compress all that, get the more isometric look, so I'm gonna back it up to somewhere around 10,000. And then if I just reset the rotation of this box layer, I'll just right click on orientation, say reset, and then just slightly adjust this so it's rotated on the y-axis. We're seeing that extrusion. I can go into that extrusion property again underneath the geometry options, and I can animate this moving in and out. But now we're seeing the next issue, and I'll just exaggerate this a little bit further, rotate it even more, and you'll notice that the layer looks like it's scaling up and down as I'm extruding it. What's actually happening is it's moving in Z space, but not on its own local coordinates. It's on the world coordinates. So basically what the scene is aligned to. If I disable this expression for a second so I can modify the Z position, you'll notice this is moving forward and backward on the world coordinates Z plane, not aligned to the Z plane of this box. That's obviously a problem if you want to be able to rotate the layer. Fortunately, I've already rewritten the expression so that it properly adjusts the position based on the axis of the layer itself, but I'm not going to walk you through that complex process. Instead, I'm just going to show you the button rig that I've created for you to download so that you don't even have to do any of this work manually, and you can start making buttons in After Effects that are super customizable and fun to use right away. So follow the link in the description if you want to download the template file, and I'll show you how we use it right here. I'm going to go ahead and just hide this box layer. So let me turn that off, and I'm gonna double click on the project panel to import a file. Buttonmasher.aet for template is what you want. If you try to open this, it's going to open just the composition as a new project. You basically can't mess up the project file this way. But importing it into a new project, it's gonna bring it in a folder, and we have a single comp inside called button. I'm gonna drag that out, delete this folder, and we'll jump into that button comp to see what it looks like. So here we have basically the same setup with the camera, the ambient light, a button shape in the text, but also a button stroke. So this rig is actually designed for you to not do anything with inside of the comp itself. It's all set up using the Essential Graphics panel so that if I were to bring it into another comp, say this one, let's actually turn that text layer off. I'll grab this button comp, drag it out into this comp, and you'll notice over in the properties panel, I have essential properties showing up. All of these essential properties are also visible right here in the layer, but basically I've set up controls that allow you to customize the shape and behavior of this button rig. So first of all, you can change this text to anything you want. So I could change this to say, Jake in motion, and that's going to update not only the text, but also the size of the box. There are also font controls here if you want to change that. You can change the color of the text to anything else that you'd like. We have a color for the face, which is the main shape layer color, and then we also have an extrusion color, which is the extrusion. But we also have a stroke option here. It's defaulted to a value of 20. If you don't want a stroke, just set it down to 0, but you could also increase that however you'd like. We have a roundness value, so you can make this a box, or you can give it a little bit of roundness, or you can round it a lot. Up to 100% will be a perfectly rounded box. We have controls for the width offset, so that if you need to, you can give a little bit more room on the width and the height. And finally, we have X, Y, and Z rotation so that you can rotate this around in 3D space. Now, the reason that I set it up this way is because the advanced 3D render engine actually disables a lot about what's possible in a comp. If I go to the 3D renderer options in the composition settings, you'll notice that it disables effects, blending modes, layer styles, track mats, masks, and preserve underlying transparency on 3D models, 3D text and shape layers, collapse 3D precompositions, continuously rasterized 3D layers, motion blur and depth of field, light transmission, all kinds of stuff. Basically, it's very limited in what you're able to do outside of just extruding 3D layers. I mean, there is more to the advanced 3D engine that we're not touching because we're going for a stylized look. But what this means is I can't add any effects in here. I can't use adjustment layers the way that I want to. The solution is to add all of these controls to the Essential Graphics panel so that they're accessible outside of this comp. and just add that comp to a comp that's not using the advanced 3D render engine, which we have set up here because that's where we created our little rig. So I'm gonna change this back to classic 3D, and you'll notice that I still have access to all of those 3D controls, including the extrusion. So I can still access all of those advanced 3D render engine controls inside of a normal comp here. And because it's a pre-comp, it's just basically a 2D layer as far as After Effects is concerned. I can scale this, rotate it around. I just can't collapse the transformations of the comp or actually have access to that 3D geometry. But all these built-in controls allow me to manipulate the layer as if I was inside the advanced 3D render engine. On top of that, I also have an extrude from value. So you see that currently it's animating the way that we created the button, but you could change this to center and it's going to extrude from the center of the layer or the front, and it will behave like the default behavior. I'll change that back to the back value, and I've already added in these keyframes on the extrude property to get you started, just so you can press U to quickly start animating that button press. Another really cool thing about essential properties is that you can duplicate this comp. It's another instance of the same comp, but have access to all of those essential properties. So you could have two buttons referencing the same essential graphics comp, but completely change them. So I could grab the source text up here and I could say masher, and on the first one, we'll change that to button. And all of these properties that I've added to the Essential Graphics panel are completely customizable independently of each other, even though they're referencing the same source comp. But that's about it for Button Masher. I hope that you get a lot of use out of this template. If you do use it, be sure to tag me at Jake in Motion so I can see what you created, and join our Discord server. Again, the invite link is down in the description. Check out jakeinmotion.com to learn more about launching After Effects. I hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
It looks fun.